The email arrived at 2:07 a.m., which, in a perfect world, should have been the first warning. It wasn't from a recruiter, a client, or even spam. The subject line was simply, available. Now, Caleb Maxwell, a 34-year-old freelance architectural photographer whose career was slowly dissolving into a puddle of real estate drone shots, rubbed the sleep out of his eyes. He was hunched over his laptop in his cramped, overpriced San Francisco apartment, fueled by stale coffee and existential dread. He clicked it open. The sender was listed as archivist_404@voidmail.com. The body of the email contained only a single paragraph of text and a hyperlink. A property has surfaced that demands your specific talents, Mr. Maxwell. It is not a public listing. No MLS. No brokers. The fee is $25,000 for a 48-hour exclusive shoot. No portfolio usage. No prints. You sign the NDA and you walk away with the money. The address is attached to the link. Do not use GPS, use the coordinates provided to plot a physical map. This is non-negotiable. If you fail to acknowledge receipt of this email within 12 hours, the offer is retracted. Caleb snorted. 25 grand for 2 days' work? It was either a drug cartel money laundering scheme or a prank. He clicked the link, a flicker of professional curiosity overriding his better judgment. It led to a password-protected, single-page website. The password, which the email hadn't provided, was instantly solved by a hunch. He typed in the only 4-digit code that mattered to a photographer, 1939, the year the Kodachrome film was invented. The page loaded. It wasn't a joke. It was the most stunning, unsettling structure he had ever seen. The house, known only as the Ashwood Residence, was a monstrous, beautiful anomaly. It wasn't Victorian, modernist, or any style Caleb could name. It was built of a strange, dark stone that seemed to absorb light, making its shadows appear unnaturally deep. It stood on a bluff overlooking a desolate stretch of the Northern California coast, ringed by a thick, dark forest that looked less like trees and more like black, skeletal fingers reaching out from the earth. The most disturbing architectural feature was the placement of the windows. They weren't aligned. They were scattered across the facade like random punctures, and almost all of them were narrow, vertical slits, except for one, a massive, perfectly circular window on the top floor, dead center, that looked exactly like a cold, unblinking eye staring back at the viewer. Beneath the image was the contract, a dense wall of legalese. Caleb skimmed for the key points. Clause 3A. The photographer must not bring a cell phone, tablet, or any device capable of connecting to the internet. A supplied satellite phone is required for emergencies only. Clause 6B. All photography must be strictly interior and exterior stills. No panoramic shots. No reflections. Clause 11C. The residence has a caretaker. The photographer must not speak to, approach, or acknowledge the caretaker in any way. The caretaker will not speak to or acknowledge the photographer. The final 2 lines were the coordinates. A terrifyingly remote spot, about 6 hours north of him, deep in the Mendocino wilderness. Caleb leaned back, his pulse thrumming with a mixture of greed and a primal dread. $25,000. It would solve his debt and buy him a year of peace. The entire thing was unsettling. But that was the point, wasn't it? Rich people had bizarre secrets. This was just another one he could turn a blind eye to. He typed out his reply. I accept. Send the NDA. Within 10 minutes, a second, encrypted email arrived with the contract and a brief schedule. Drive to the coordinates, arrive by 5 p.m. tomorrow. A delivery service would drop off the keys and the satellite phone at the last gas station before the turn-off. Caleb printed the coordinates. He opened his supply closet and pulled out his favorite camera, the old Nikon D850. A workhorse that didn't need Wi-Fi or GPS. As he packed his lenses, a sudden, cold draft swept through his apartment. Despite the windows being sealed, he shivered and glanced at the printout of the house. He found himself staring again at that massive, circular window on the top floor. It suddenly seemed darker, deeper. For the briefest, most irrational moment, Caleb was certain the circle was slightly smaller than it had been before. As if something had just blinked. He rubbed his eyes again, chalking it up to fatigue. $25,000 he had committed now. The Ashwood Residence was waiting, and he had a terrible, sinking feeling that once he stepped inside, his debt wouldn't be the only thing that would be solved. Caleb's journey north was a study in escalating isolation. The traffic of the Bay Area melted away into the dry, golden hills of wine country, which eventually surrendered to the towering, damp redwood forests of Mendocino County. The air grew heavy and cold, and the sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, turning the midday into a perpetual, somber twilight. He had stopped at the last civilized point, a forgotten gas station attached to a dilapidated liquor store named The Last Stop. The clerk, a skeletal man who looked like he'd been guarding the same lottery ticket since 1985, didn't make eye contact. Following the email's instruction, Caleb waited outside. Promptly at 3:15 p.m., a matte black sedan, polished to a mirror shine, pulled up. It had no license plates, only tinted windows that were completely opaque. The back window lowered a mere 2 inches. A gloved hand, a woman's, judging by the slender wrist, emerged. It didn't hold a package. It held a black, leather-bound notebook and a small, antique iron key. The key was heavy and cold, etched with spiraling, indecipherable symbols. Caleb approached the window. "I'm Caleb Maxwell." The hand remained motionless. No voice answered. It was total silence, save for the engine's quiet idle. Caleb quickly understood. Clause 11C applied to everyone involved. He took the key and the notebook. Inside the notebook, the first page held the VFE disabled satellite phone and a laminated card with instructions. The handwriting was elegant, precise, and utterly devoid of personality. Instruction card: drive 1.4 miles further. Turn onto the dirt track at the coordinates. The gate code is 5309 star. You have until 6 p.m. to enter. Your stay is 48 hours. Your $25,000 will be wired 72 hours after you transmit the photos. A crucial element is the lighting. The structure is designed to be photographed at the hour of deep shadow, twilight, and the hour of unveiling, dawn. Plan accordingly. Our e-minder. Do not acknowledge the caretaker. Do not attempt to open any doors that are already locked. Do not use flash. Caleb slipped the items into his camera bag. When he looked back at the sedan, the window was already up. The car pulled out silently, accelerated without a sound, and vanished down the highway as if absorbed by the trees. It was official. He was doing a photo shoot for an entity that communicated exclusively through silent hand gestures and encrypted emails. Following the instructions, he found the turnoff, an unmarked, overgrown logging road that clawed its way up a steep incline. The drive was brutal, the tires spinning on loose shale and mud. After 10 minutes of teeth-rattling ascent, the forest abruptly opened up to a massive, wrought-iron gate. He typed the code. The gates groaned open with a sound like tearing metal. The track beyond was paved with dark, perfectly maintained cobblestones. A moment later, he saw it. The Ashwood Residence. It was larger and more imposing than the picture suggested, perched on a grassy cliff edge. The stone that formed its walls was truly black, but not uniformly so. It was streaked with veins of a pale, powdery substance that, in the last dying light of the afternoon, looked sickeningly like calcified ash. The front yard was not manicured, but intentionally wild. The grass was long and dry, rustling in a wind that Caleb couldn't feel. Dominating the landscape was a single, ancient oak tree twisted into a horrifying spiral, with limbs that seemed to be growing down into the soil rather than up to the sky. As Caleb drove closer, he pulled out his D850 and looked through the viewfinder, hoping a professional lens would rationalize the unsettling architecture. It did the opposite. Through the glass, the house seemed to shimmer, the lines slightly wavering, as if the entire structure was breathing. He parked on the cobblestone turnaround. The air here was dead, heavy, and smelled faintly of ozone and something burnt decades ago. Then, he saw the caretaker. The figure was standing perfectly still about 50 yards away, near the twisted oak. It was a man, dressed entirely in dark, shapeless clothes. A thick, buttoned coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured his face in shadow. He was extremely tall and thin, motionless, holding a small, unlit lantern. He wasn't staring at Caleb, or the car, or the house. He was staring directly at the ground, a pillar of absolute stillness. Caleb's throat tightened. His primal instinct screamed, "Get back in the car. Drive away." But the 25,000 reasons, coupled with the iron key in his hand, forced him to shut off the engine. He grabbed his gear and the antique key, the symbols on it digging into his palm. The front door of the Ashwood Residence was made of heavy, black wood, set deep into a stone archway. He inserted the key. It turned with a smooth, chilling snick that echoed louder than it should have. Caleb pushed the door open, stepped over the threshold, and was immediately enveloped by the interior. The smell of ash was stronger here, mixed with dry rot and a profound cold that seemed to come not from the air, but from the very stones. He was standing in a vast entry hall, a cylinder of shadow rising 3 stories high. He turned to look back out. The caretaker was gone. The immense black door swung silently shut behind him, plunging the entry hall into near absolute darkness. Caleb was left standing in a house designed by a lunatic, holding only a camera and a satellite phone that he wasn't allowed to use. He fumbled for his bag, needing to pull out his camera to get his bearings. The low light and deep shadows were already confusing his senses. He took 3 steps forward into the hall. Scrape. A sharp, metallic noise echoed from the floor above, perfectly clear in the oppressive silence. It sounded like a chair being dragged across a stone floor, directly over his head. Caleb froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The house is empty, he told himself. It's just the wind. But the house was silent, and the noise had come from inside. And he suddenly remembered the colossal, unblinking eye of the circular window on the top floor. He looked up, toward the massive spiral staircase that corkscrewed into the darkness. "Hello?" he whispered, instantly regretting breaking the silence. No answer. Only the sound of his own breathing. And then a faint, dry creak that seemed to originate from the walls themselves, a structural sigh, as if the Ashwood residence had just settled in, ready for his visit. Caleb stood paralyzed in the echoing dark. He waited for the sound, the scrape of the chair, the structural creak, to repeat, but the silence that followed was total, heavier than before. It felt less like the absence of sound and more like sound itself had been smothered. He reached into his bag and pulled out the small, industrial-grade flashlight he had packed, ignoring the satellite phone's emergency-only status. The beam sliced through the cavernous entry hall. The architecture was not merely unconventional. It was hostile. The walls were paneled in a matte black wood that absorbed almost all light, making the space feel infinitely larger than its physical boundaries. The ceiling was lost in shadows, but Caleb could discern a spiral staircase, less a functional design and more a dark, carved spine twisting into the upper floors. He remembered the instructions. No panoramic shots. No reflections. This was why. The house was designed to confound the human eye, to exploit the limitations of depth perception. A panoramic photo would capture too much context, too much information. Reflections, like those in polished floors or mirrors, could double the distorted space, something the client clearly wanted to avoid. Caleb clicked the shutter on his D850 to take a low-light test shot. The quiet click was swallowed instantly by the room. He began his mandated survey of the ground floor. The layout defied logic. From the entry hall, 5 different doorways opened, none of them symmetrically placed, and each one leading into a different kind of architectural nightmare. He chose the largest door, a heavy oak slab that opened into the main living area. It was impossibly long. The room stretched out before him like a tunnel, 100 feet or more, illuminated only by thin, vertical window slits placed regularly along one side. The opposite wall was solid black stone, unbroken. The perspective was warped. The far end of the room, instead of receding in a natural taper, seemed to distort, giving the illusion that the floor rose slightly or that the far wall leaned inward. Caleb raised his camera, his professional eye already calculating exposure. The lighting was the subject here. The way the narrow windows cast long, razor-thin bars of light across the floor. As he walked down the room to set up his tripod, he noticed a feature that made his blood run cold. There were no less than 12 doorways leading off the main hall, 6 on each side, all identical, black, and perfectly closed. He checked the card in his pocket. Do not attempt to open any doors that are already locked. Since these were closed, they were presumably locked. He set up his first shot, framing the perspective down the long, unsettling corridor of the living room. As he looked through the viewfinder, he noticed a minuscule movement in one of the far window slits, a brief flash, like the reflection of glass. He lowered the camera. Nothing. Just a sliver of dark, wooded exterior visible through the narrow opening. He resumed shooting, documenting the room's impossible length. He was so focused on achieving the perfect, unsettling balance of light and shadow that he failed to notice the subtle shift until he reviewed the images on the camera screen. He scrolled through the dozen photos he had just taken. The perspective was wrong. In the first 6 images, the 12th door, the one furthest from him, was clearly visible on the right wall. But in the 7th image, the 12th door was gone. The wall was solid black stone, the same as the 6 images before it. But there was no break, no outline, No hint of a hinge or a handle where the door should have been. Caleb backed away, staring at the far end of the room. Had he miscounted? He looked again. There were 5 doors on his side, and 5 doors on the opposite side. 10 in total. The far end of the room was solid. He checked the screen again. The first 6 pictures clearly showed 12 doors. He couldn't have imagined the doors. They were huge, recessed black panels. He flipped back to the first image. The 12th door was there, clear as day. He flipped forward to the 7th. The 12th door was gone. The wall was seamless. A cold, clammy sweat broke out on his forehead. The architecture wasn't just confusing, it was changing. He forced himself to walk back toward the entrance, his eyes glued to the wall where the door had vanished. He counted the remaining doors, touching the panels to assure himself they were solid. 10 doors. 10 solid doors. He felt the unsettling sensation of being observed. He glanced toward the window slits, half expecting to see the caretaker's face pressed against the glass. Nothing. He retreated into the main entry hall, his heart now beating a frantic, uneven rhythm. He needed air. He needed a moment to rationalize this impossibility. He reached for the black front door, ready to violate the contract and step outside for a breath of coastal air. He pulled on the handle. It didn't budge. He pulled harder. Lock. He remembered the iron key in his pocket. He dug it out, inserted it into the lock, and turned it. The lock mechanism did not engage. The key turned uselessly, failing to snick as it had on the way in. It was now just a dead weight of iron in a dysfunctional lock. Caleb was trapped inside a house that defied geometry, and he had 48 hours left on the clock. Just then, a faint, rhythmic thud began, coming from the floor above, directly over his head. It was softer than the previous scrape, more deliberate. It sounded like something heavy and soft, a large sack, or perhaps a body, being repeatedly dropped on the stone floor, directly underneath the great, staring circular window. He checked the front door again, slamming his shoulder against the black oak panel. The house felt less like a building and more like a massive, silent vault. The lock was irrevocably jammed, or perhaps magically sealed. He was isolated. His only emergency linked the satellite phone he was forbidden to use unless his life was in immediate peril. And who was he supposed to call? Archivist _404. The instructions, however, were clear. Complete the survey. The second floor had to be documented next. Caleb turned, his flashlight beam struggling against the black-paneled walls of the entry hall. The spiral staircase, the house's dark spine, beckoned. It was constructed entirely of the same light-absorbing stone as the exterior and lacked any banister, offering only a precarious, cold handrail carved directly into the central pillar. He began the ascent, his steps echoing loudly in the high, cylindrical space. With every turn of the spiral, the thudding sound grew louder, vibrating slightly through the stone beneath his boots. Thud. 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 It was coming from the floor directly above the landing where the stairs terminated. The second floor. He reached the landing. The second floor was laid out similarly to the first. A massive, dark corridor stretching into the gloom, lined with more identical, forbidding black doors. But unlike the ground floor, this corridor had a single, unsettling variation. The windows were replaced entirely by a row of massive, vertical, dark mirrors. Caleb stopped dead, remembering the second critical instruction. No reflections. He shone his light toward the nearest mirror. The surface was made of something ancient and dull, casting back a distorted, funhouse image. In the reflection, Caleb looked pale, sweat-soaked, and terrified. But the thing that chilled him to the bone was the distortion of the hallway behind him. In the mirror, the corridor didn't stretch away into darkness. It appeared to turn abruptly to the left, and another, smaller figure, not the caretaker, but a hunched, juvenile shape, was visible at the corner, looking back toward him. Caleb snapped his head around. The real corridor was straight. No turn, no figure, only the long, straight tunnel of black wood and stone. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone. The thudding continued, slightly louder now, coming from the far end of this confusing, reflective hallway. He had to get his shots. The contract demanded the documentation of every room. He had to navigate a hall of impossible reflections, where the image of the world was actively lying to him. He raised his camera, trying to use the viewfinder as a mental shield against the optical deceptions. He began taking his photographs, carefully angling the camera to avoid capturing the mirror surfaces directly, focusing only on the texture of the walls and the ceiling. As he moved down the hallway, the thudding noise became an agonizing distraction. He was about halfway down the corridor when he realized the source of the noise wasn't coming from the ceiling above the second floor. It was coming from behind the walls of the second floor. He stopped at a dark, locked door, the 10th in the sequence. The stone here felt colder, and the faint burnt smell was stronger. He pressed his ear against the wood. Thud. 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 The impact was directly on the other side of the door, and it was coupled with a sound so soft, so dry, that it barely registered over his own frantic heartbeat. A rasping, choking inhale. Whatever was making the sound was alive, and it was right there, Caleb instinctively recalled. He looked down the hallway towards the final mirror at the far end. In its dull reflection, the small, hunched figure from before was back. This time, it wasn't looking at him. It was standing at the threshold of the last door, the one at the very end of the hall. And it was violently scratching at the wood. As sea rape. Scrape. Scrape. A frantic, high-pitched noise completely different from the low thudding. Caleb shouted, a raw, choked sound that the house immediately devoured. He spun around to look. Down the real hallway. The wall was solid. There was no door at the end. The corridor simply terminated in black stone, exactly as it had on the ground floor. He looked back at the mirror. The figure was gone, the surface now just showing a distorted reflection of the empty hallway. He backed away, tripping over his own tripod. He scrambled to his feet, the terror finally overriding his commitment to the job. He had to reach the third floor. The thudding was his cue, his horrifying deadline. He reached the staircase leading to the third and final floor, the attic, the place with the great, circular eye window. As he placed his foot on the first step, he glanced down the second floor hallway, toward the 10th door he had been leaning against. The door was now slightly ajar, a sliver of blackness against the black wall. And from the gap, a low, wet whisper slithered out, utterly colorless and dry, like fine, burned dust blown across a tombstone. No flash. Caleb didn't pause. He scrambled up the final flight of stairs, his camera bag catching momentarily on the stone pillar. He didn't look back at the ajar door, focusing only on the coordinates of his escape. The third floor landing. The third floor was a single, vast space, an attic structure with a ceiling that vaulted high into the dark eaves. The smell of ash and ozone here was overwhelming, stinging his nostrils and making his eyes water. The central feature was the one he had seen in the photograph. The great, circular window. It was immense, easily 12 feet in diameter, set into the far wall. It wasn't glass, but a massive, polished disc of the same dark, light-absorbing stone, fitted with a single pane of thick, smoked glass at the center. Like a cold, unblinking pupil. It faced the sea, but the sun had long set. Through the smoked glass pupil, he could see only a sliver of the starless, black night sky and the churning, invisible darkness of the Pacific Ocean below. The entire attic floor was coated in a fine layer of grey dust, not ordinary house dust, but a fine, powdery ash that crunched softly under his boots. And in the center of the floor, directly beneath the window, was the source of the incessant thudding. It was not a body, or a sack, or a chair. It was a tripod. An exact replica of Caleb's own heavy-duty tripod, but made of old, blackened iron. It was lying on its side, and one of its metal feet was rhythmically, mechanically striking the ash-covered floor. Thud, thud, thud. As he watched, hypnotized, the tripod gave a final, agonizing heave, and one of its legs retracted with a dry clack, silencing the sound forever. This was the Caretaker station. A camera was mounted on the tripod, a bulky, ancient-looking box camera from the early 20th century. Its lens aimed directly at the center of the room. Caleb approached the tripod, his flashlight beam illuminating the area. Beside the iron tripod lay a collection of objects that made his stomach twist. A stack of photos, all black and white, all slightly curled. They were photographs of the attic room itself, taken from the tripod's perspective. In every photo, standing exactly where Caleb was standing now, was a different man, dressed in formal, vintage clothing, each man frozen in an expression of absolute, wide-eyed terror. A journal. A small, leather-bound book, its pages brittle. He didn't dare touch it, mindful of the strict no-contact rule. A single, charred lens cap. It looked exactly like one from his own equipment, but badly burned, resting on a small, engraved brass plate. The plaque read, "The Witness." This wasn't just a photography assignment. It was a ritual. The previous photographers had become the subjects of the Caretaker's grim, final shots. He suddenly realized the full implications of the no-flash rule. Flash photography was about capturing a moment, but more importantly, it introduced a new, hostile light source. The house demanded the hour of deep shadow and the hour of unveiling, specific, weak light. The house was fragile. It was scared of light. And the tripod camera, the Witness, was facing the center of the room, waiting for its next subject. Caleb. He had to get his required shots of this room, the final interior documentation, and then get out before the house decided it was time for his Witness portrait. He set up his own tripod, positioning it safely to the side, away from the Caretaker station. He had to capture the imposing nature of the circular window. He looked through the lens. The sheer scale of the stone eye was magnificent and terrifying. As he adjusted the focus, he noticed something in the black smoked glass pupil. A tiny, faint shape, swirling within the glass itself. He zoomed in slowly, using the powerful telephoto lens. The swirling shape was not a reflection. It was inside the glass, embedded in the stone. It was a thin, spiraling streak of a pale, bone-white powder, identical to the veins of ash on the exterior dot, and as he stared, the streak seemed to move, swirling slowly, drawing itself into a single, compact point. A whisper of cold air brushed the back of Caleb's neck. He wheeled around, expecting to see the caretaker or the small, hunched figure from the mirror. The room was empty. But the door to the third-floor staircase, the door he had just slammed shut, was now open, and leaning against the frame was the caretaker. He was still in the dark coat and hat, his face lost in shadow. He was perfectly still, but he was no longer staring at the ground. He had turned his face toward Caleb. He wasn't speaking, but the silence he projected was a wall of crushing hostility. The caretaker was enforcing the contract's final, most terrifying term, 48 hours. You can't leave until the time is up. Caleb stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. It rolled across the ash-covered floor, its beam pointing erratically. The light flickered across the wall beneath the great circular window and illuminated a series of barely visible, desperate markings scratched into the stone. The markings were a single, repeated word carved over and over again until the stone was frayed. Reflect, 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 reflect. The previous victims hadn't been afraid of reflections. They had desperately sought them. They wanted something, a way out, a contradiction, a truth that the mirrors in the house refused to show them. They wanted the house to betray itself. And now, the caretaker was blocking the exit, waiting for Caleb to finish his final shots. Caleb scrambled to retrieve his light, turning back to the window one last time. The white streak of ash in the smoked glass pupil had finished coalescing. It was no longer a streak. It was a single, pale, perfectly round pinprick of white. It looked exactly like a pupil dilating in a pitch-black room, having just found a point of focus. On him, Caleb was trapped between the unblinking, hostile silence of the caretaker and the terrifying knowledge etched into the wall. The previous photographer's desperate plea, reflect, was not a warning of danger, but a desperate instruction, a failure report. Why would they want reflections? He scrambled to a crouching position next to his tripod, his eyes darting from the motionless caretaker to the great stone eye window. The caretaker was an immovable pillar of shadow, enforcing the 48-hour term like a clock with a human face. Caleb thought back to the contract. No cell phone nor GPS. Isolation. The house wants no outside contact. No reflections. The house wants no true image of itself. No flash. The house fears sudden, revealing light. But the caretaker's ancient camera, the witness, didn't use flash. It used long, time exposures and natural light. The hour of deep shadow and the hour of unveiling. The house was designed to be photographed, yes, but only in its preferred state, obscured, deep in shadow, and deceptive. What if the contract wasn't a list of rules for the photographer, but a list of safeguards for the house and the ash? The pale, powdery substance streaking the exterior stone, coating the attic floor, and now congealing in the window's pupil. It was the house's substance. Caleb suddenly remembered the coordinates for the house were given to him to prevent him from using GPS. Why? GPS coordinates are based on the stable, geometric grid of the earth. If the house's geometry was constantly shifting, if the doors could disappear and the corridors could bend, then the coordinates would be the only thing proving the house occupied a fixed point in space. The house was not just structurally wrong, it was spatially wrong. It was a geometrical anomaly, and photography was the only way to document its deceit. Caleb looked at the eye window again. The central pupil, the single point of clarity in the massive dark stone, was the key. He had his D850 loaded with a sensitive memory card, and he still had his two crucial shots of the third floor to take. He realized his survival depended not on following the rules, but on finding the one rule he could break to expose the house without triggering the caretaker's final, fatal action. No flash. That was the command whispered from behind the door. He looked at the iron tripod of the witness. It was aimed at the center of the room. It was waiting for him to stand in the light. Caleb ignored the caretaker and began setting up his second shot of the attic. He positioned his camera to capture the large stone window. He looked through the lens. That circular pupil, the point of pale ash, had grown slightly. It was watching. He adjusted his shutter speed, taking it lower and lower, forcing the camera to gather every last photon of ambient light in the room. He was preparing for a long exposure, the kind that turns ghosts into streaks and captures movement over time. He took the first shot. Click. A 6-second exposure. The shutter opened and closed with excruciating slowness. When the image appeared on the screen, Caleb nearly dropped the camera. The image was grainy, but clear. It showed the entire third floor, the eye window, the ash-covered floor, and the caretaker standing motionless by the door. But the long exposure had also captured what the human eye could not. Trailing from the caretaker's feet, across the ash-dusted floor, was a faint, wavering streak of white, a ghostly track that led not to the door, but directly to the witness tripod in the center of the room. The caretaker had not been standing still. He had been slowly pacing, checking the frame of his own camera. The house was forcing the witnesses to stand in a certain spot. Caleb turned his attention back to the eye window for his final, most critical shot. He had an idea. It was a desperate gamble, betting his life on a piece of photographic physics. He reached into his bag and pulled out the lens he never used for interiors, a wide-angle, low-distortion lens. He quickly mounted it, aiming it again at the window. He set the focus to infinity. He adjusted the shutter to a full 30-second exposure. This was his hour of unveiling shot. He had to capture the eye window and, more importantly, the movement within its pupil. He pressed the shutter button. The quiet click was followed by the small red light on the camera's body illuminating, indicating the long exposure was in progress. In that 30 seconds of vulnerability, the silence in the room became unbearable. The caretaker was still motionless, but the temperature in the room plummeted. Caleb stared into the lens of the eye window. The pale ash pupil was actively swirling now, rapidly condensing, responding to the camera's long, silent observation. It was concentrating. He looked back at the caretaker. The man remained static, but the shadow under his hat seemed to deepen, his stillness radiating pure, lethal tension. 10 seconds. Caleb realized what the final shot of the witness was meant to capture. The moment of a human being's dissolution, the body turning into the fine white ash that coated the room, the same ash that was now gathering in the window's pupil. The house was slowly absorbing them, and the caretaker was there to document the final moment of the human form's unveiling, its transition into architectural material. 5 seconds. He couldn't stand still. He had to introduce the very thing the house rejected. He looked directly at the caretaker, whose head now seemed to be slowly tilting, breaking its static pose. 3 seconds. Caleb grabbed his external flash unit. He did not mount it to the camera. He raised it above his head and pointed it directly at the caretaker, his thumb hovering over the test fire button. 1 second, the camera snapped shut, ending the long exposure. Immediately, the pale ash pupil in the eye window completely vanished, replaced by a momentary, terrifying flash of pure, bone-white light from within the stone. And at that exact moment, the caretaker, breaking his silence and his stillness, let out a dry, rasping noise that was almost a shriek. Caleb didn't hesitate. He thumbed the button on the detached flash unit. A brilliant, disorienting white burst erupted, aimed not at the photo, but at the caretaker's face. The shadow under the hat was violently peeled away. In the split second of perfect, bright illumination, Caleb saw what the caretaker was. He had no features. His face was a smooth, stretched surface of black, porous stone, veined with white ash, mirroring the house itself. His wide-brimmed hat was merely a lip of rock. The flash ended. The caretaker staggered backward, emitting a sound like grinding stone, clutching at the area where a human's eyes would be. Caleb didn't wait. He looked down at the camera screen. The final shot of the third floor had been captured. The image was a nightmare of contrast. The stone eye window, the room, the caretaker recoiling from the flash. But at the center of the image, where the ash pupil had been, was a perfect, terrifying disk of pure white. And in the reflection on the lens of the witness camera, Caleb could see the truth. The image of the house was stable, geometric, and utterly normal. He had the photos. The contract was fulfilled. He bolted, scrambling past the blinded, groaning pillar of stone. The blinding moment of the flash was Caleb's only window. He didn't wait to see if his improvised attack had harmed the caretaker, whose shriek sounded like two tectonic plates rubbing together. He tucked his D850 into his camera bag and launched himself down the spiral staircase. His feet slipped on the cold stone steps, and he fell, tumbling down half a flight, the heavy camera bag cushioning the impact but jarring his body. He ignored the throbbing pain, fueled by adrenaline and the raw, scraping sound from the attic behind him. The caretaker was recovering. He reached the second-floor landing and didn't even glance down the corridor of reflective mirrors. The image in his mind of the faceless stone mask was enough. He reached the ajar door of the second-floor staircase. It was still open a sliver, a black invitation to the void. He leaped through, slamming his body against the door to force it shut. He heard a wet, violent thud from the room behind it, followed by a heavy, rasping inhale. He raced down the final flight of stairs to the ground floor. The expansive entry hall, which had been daunting before, now felt like a death trap. He reached the colossal front door. The ancient iron key was still useless, a dead weight in the lock. The contract had said 48 hours. He was only 12 hours in. He had to physically breach the lock. He spotted a heavy, wrought iron fire poker standing next to a defunct fireplace. He seized it, his hands slick with sweat, and jammed the pointed end into the lock mechanism. He hammered the poker with the butt of his heavy boot, trying to splinter the wood around the lock. The metal shrieked against the iron key, but the black oak door was impossibly dense. It didn't yield. Above him, the sound of the caretaker descending was not the controlled, silent movement of before. It was a chaotic, clumsy clattering, the sound of heavy, unfeeling stone limbs impacting the stairs. Caleb slammed the poker against the lock one last time. The door wouldn't break, but the poker snapped in half. He was trapped. and the caretaker was almost on the ground floor. He looked around the empty hall, desperate. His eyes fell on the 5 black, asymmetric doors leading to the interior rooms. The one that changed. He realized that the architecture was the only exit. The house didn't obey physics. It obeyed the photographer's perceptions. If he could find the door that had been erased, perhaps he could find one that had been created. He spun around and raced into the long, stretching living room, the corridor of false depths. He ran to the end, counting the doors, 10 in total, 5 on each side. The wall at the end seamless. He checked his memory. The door that vanished was the 12th door. He hadn't just miscounted. The room was physically 2 doors shorter now than when he first photographed it. He shone his light on the end wall. It was solid, dark stone. Reflect. Caleb understood. The previous victims didn't want a reflection to break the house's power. They wanted a reflection to show the true space. The caretaker's heavy, stone-on-stone footsteps entered the long hallway behind him. The sound of its movement was terrifying, slow, heavy, and implacable. Caleb had no time. He had to photograph the geometry to break the geometry. He pulled his camera out of the bag, set it to the widest angle possible, and aimed it straight at the seamless end wall, taking care to capture the entire length of the hallway in the frame. He set the focus to maximum depth and prayed. Click. A quick, 1-second shot. He snatched the camera away and looked at the screen. The image was a panoramic view of the unsettling corridor. The wall at the end was still solid black stone. But in the photo, the perspective was suddenly, jarringly correct. The depth was normal. And because the depth was suddenly correct, the photograph revealed a crucial anomaly. The far wall was too far away. The photo showed that the corridor extended an extra 30 feet beyond where the physical wall stood. And in that extra space, the photo showed the outline of the 12th door, the one that had vanished. It was recessed, hidden behind an illusory wall of solid stone. The house was forcing him to see a false end. Caleb turned and hammered his fist against the real end wall. The solid stone. It's a psychological barrier. It's an illusion of space. He hammered again, focusing his rage, his terror, and his will on the point where the photo showed the door should be. The stone didn't crack, but it felt suddenly, sickeningly thin. The caretaker was only 20 feet behind him. Its labored, stone breathing audible now. Caleb gathered all his strength, lowered his shoulder, and threw his body against the wall, not to break the stone, but to break the illusion. With a sound like ripping paper, the stone wall gave way. It wasn't stone at all, but a thin, rigid panel camouflaged to perfection. Caleb tumbled through a newly opened archway and landed hard on another dark stone floor. He was in a small, empty room, the 12th room, the one that had been erased. And in the center of this room, resting on a pedestal, was a simple, copper-wired exterior floodlight, the kind of blinding, high-wattage light a photographer might use to illuminate a whole building. This was the house's biggest secret. The 48-hour clock wasn't about the photographer. It was the amount of time the house needed to absorb the light-hating ash back into its structure after the photographer's departure. Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed the satellite phone out of his bag, the emergency-only lifeline he hadn't used. He pulled the battery out, jammed the phone's exposed copper wiring against the floodlight's bare terminals, and shoved the whole setup onto the pedestal. A blinding, violent flash, not of a camera, but of raw electrical current, illuminated the small room. The floodlight surged with power and exploded into searing white light, aimed directly back through the opening. The house screamed. Not a human scream, but the high, shattering sound of stressed crystal. The dark walls around Caleb cracked instantly. Thin veins of white ash fracturing like glass. He ran back to the opening. The caretaker had recalled from the light, its stone face smoking, but it was still standing. The floodlight was doing its job. The sudden, high-intensity light was dissolving the house's structural illusions. The illusion was gone. The real front door, which had been right next to the entry to the living room all along, was now clearly visible, no longer hidden by shadow. And the lock was sprung open. The pieces of the broken poker scattered on the floor. Caleb dove out, grabbing his camera bag as he ran. He burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind him. He didn't look back. He sprinted toward his car, the sound of splintering wood and scraping stone echoing from inside the Ashwood Residence. He reached his car, threw his gear inside, and tore down the cobblestone path. He was already driving onto the dirt track when the gate groaned open just in front of him. He was out. He stopped the car 3 miles down the highway, finally pulling out the satellite phone. He reconnected the battery and powered it up. It immediately flashed a notification. Images ready for transmission. Waiting for signal. Caleb looked at the screen. He hadn't wired the money. He had wired a message. The client didn't want the photos after 72 hours. They wanted the photos transmitted after 48 hours. The only way the caretaker's time was up was if the contract was fulfilled. He pressed the send button. The phone began the slow, torturous process of beaming the high-resolution files into the ionosphere. As the progress bar crept to 50%, Caleb looked in his rearview mirror. The black, mate sedan, the one that delivered the key, was parked 20 feet behind him on the dark highway. No lights, no engine noise. And leaning against the driver's side door, silhouetted against the dark tree line, was the caretaker. He wasn't standing still anymore. He was slowly raising his stone arm, pointing directly at the camera bag on Caleb's passenger seat. The D850 was safe, but the memory card, the evidence of the house's changing geometry and the caretaker's face, was still inside. The silent figure raising its arm was the final, terrifying punctuation mark to the contract. The $25,000 was for the photos, but the silence and the secrets were non-negotiable. The moment Caleb broke the illusion with the flash, the payment structure shifted. Now, the cost was his compliance, or his life. The satellite phone in his hand was blinking. Transmission 75% complete. Caleb shoved the gear lever into drive, tires spitting gravel as he accelerated wildly onto the highway. The black sedan remained motionless in his rearview mirror. He sped through the dark, winding redwood forest. The caretaker, however, wasn't using the sedan. It was keeping pace with his car, not by running, but by appearing and disappearing at impossible distances. One moment, it was a distant shadow behind him. The next, it was standing unnervingly close to the edge of the road, just outside the radius of his headlights, waiting for him to pass. It was using the deep shadows of the redwood canopy like portals, skipping through the non-geometric spaces the darkness provided. He reached at 80 miles per hour, his car shuddering on a poorly maintained road. Transmission 88% complete. He had to get rid of the memory card. The fully transmitted photographs, which the client had already paid for, would contain the images of the house's illusory walls and the caretaker's stone face, rendering the entire operation pointless to the client if the secret was exposed. He needed to destroy the original evidence. He ripped open his camera bag and pulled out the D850. His hands were shaking so violently he struggled to locate the memory card slot. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The caretaker was now closer than ever, standing directly in the center of his lane, a solid, stone barrier. Caleb swerved violently, barely missing a massive redwood trunk. The stone figure was gone in the next heartbeat. Having simply stepped into the darkness. He found the card slot, fumbled the tiny SD card out, and threw the camera onto the passenger seat. The card was small, rigid, and made of robust plastic. He couldn't chew it. He couldn't break it with his bare hands. Transmission 95% complete. He needed to eliminate the evidence before the transmission reached 100%. He spotted an old, rusty cigarette lighter in the center console, an artifact from a previous owner of the car. It was his only source of fire. He pulled the lighter out and furiously flicked the wheel. On the third attempt, a small, weak flame sputtered to life. He held the SD card over the flame. The plastic casing began to bubble and warp, melting in a sickly odor. He held it until the plastic was soft and pliable. He looked in his side mirror. The black sedan was keeping pace with him now, driving without lights, hugging the shadows. The caretaker was not visible, but the presence was suffocating. Transmission 99% complete. Caleb bit down on the melting memory card with a desperate, painful crunch. The plastic splintered between his teeth, and the microscopic chip, the heart of the evidence, detached. He spat the entire mess out the window. At the exact same moment he spat the chip into the rushing night air. The satellite phone in his lap gave a final, triumphant chirp. Transmission 100% complete. Job fulfilled. The second the phone chirped, the black sedan in his side mirror slammed on its brakes, its phantom lights flashing rapidly once, like a formal, angry salute. It veered off the road and crashed into the thickest part of the redwood forest, disappearing without a sound. Caleb drove on for another 10 minutes before he finally allowed himself to slow down and pull over into a gas station parking lot, the first sign of civilization he'd seen in hours. He stepped out of the car, breathing the relatively clean, non-ash-scented air. He checked his phone. No cell service yet. But the satellite phone was dead silent. He had fulfilled the contract. The photos were sent. The raw, incriminating evidence of the house's true nature was destroyed. He was alive. He opened his laptop to check his email. No email from archivist_404. No. Confirmation. He opened his bank app. He stared at the screen, heart pounding. Account balance $25,000 added. The payment was instant. The job was complete. The nightmare was over. He leaned back against his car, the adrenaline draining, replaced by an exhausted, shaky relief. Then he noticed the camera bag on the passenger seat. He hadn't cleaned up. His tripod was a mess. His camera was covered in ash. He unzipped the bag and reached for the D850 to examine it. He pulled the camera out. The exterior was fine, but the lens he had used for the final, crucial shots, the wide-angle, low-distortion lens, was not. It wasn't shattered or scratched, but the smooth glass of the lens element was now covered in a permanent, dry residue. It was a fine, grayish-white film. Caleb rubbed it with his thumb. It wouldn't come off. It was the ash. The same white powder that streaked the house, coated the attic floor, and formed the eye window's pupil. He held the lens closer to the gas station's flickering fluorescent light. He realized the ash wasn't just a film on the lens. It was fused with the glass dot, and the ash had not settled randomly. It had etched itself into a recognizable pattern. It was a symbol. A tight, spiraling knot, identical to the indecipherable carvings on the antique iron key he had used to enter the Ashwood Residence. Caleb felt anew, called a wave of terror wash over him. The house hadn't just paid him off and let him go. It had left a mark. A permanent, non-removable piece of itself embedded on his most vital piece of equipment. The very tool he used to observe and record the world. He looked around the gas station parking lot. The mundane lighting, the concrete, the other cars, all seemed suddenly less real, less substantial. He raised the damaged lens and looked through it. The world was subtly distorted now, coated in a faint, grey filter. And in the center of his vision, the spiraling ash symbol on the lens pulsed once, a tiny, sickening heartbeat. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He drove until dawn, until he reached the familiar, buzzing grid of a major city, checking into a cheap, brightly lit motel room. He felt safe only under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, convinced that any shadow could harbor the return of the caretaker. He spent the morning in a futile effort to clean the lens. He tried distilled water, professional cleaning solutions, and even a chemical solvent, but the ash remained fixed. The symbol, the tight, spiraling knot, was permanently etched into the optical coating of the glass. It wasn't a residue. It was a scar. The lens was his primary wide-angle tool, now effectively ruined for professional work. Every photograph taken with it now carried the faint, grey filter and the subtle distortion imparted by the mark. Caleb knew he should discard the lens, but he couldn't. It felt less like an object and more like a tether. The Ashwood Residence had paid him for the photos, but it had taken back a piece of his perception. He decided to use the $25,000 to buy silence and oblivion. He wired the majority of the money to pay off his debts, the funds acting as a corrosive agent, burning away the ties that had led him to the job in the first place. For 2 weeks, he avoided photography entirely. He stayed in his apartment, living on takeout, trying to convince himself that the shadows in his corners were normal, that the silence was just the building settling. The psychological toll, however, was immense. The house had changed his relationship with space. He constantly measured distances, distrusted hallways, and avoided mirrors, terrified of seeing another false prospect or a missing doorway. The first time he returned to work, a simple interior shoot for a commercial developer, was when the true contamination began to surface. He was in a bright, modern office space, everything white and orthogonal. He set up his camera, instinctively reaching for the ruined wide-angle lens. He mounted it, peered through the viewfinder, and took the shot. On the camera screen, the high-contrast lighting of the office space looked slightly muted, tinted with that faint, unsettling gray. The lines of the floor and ceiling were slightly warped, lending the clean architecture a subtle, sickening curve. But when he zoomed in to check the focus, he noticed something in the deepest shadow of a corner. Something his naked eye had missed. In the photograph, captured through the Ashwood scarred lens, the corner where two walls met was not a clean 90-degree angle. It was a dense, intricate pattern of faint, spiraling scratches, invisible to the human eye, but rendered visible by the lens's contamination. It was the same symbol etched on his lens. The mark of the Ashwood Residence. CC Aleb immediately lowered the camera and looked at the physical corner. It was pristine, smooth drywall. He took another photo. The spirals were back in the image. He realized the house hadn't just marked his lens. It had calibrated it. The ash had created a lens that could see the latent geometry of the world. The subtle distortions, flaws, and contradictions in the physical space around him. His lens now revealed where the Ashwood-style geometry, the geometry of deceit, had managed to bleed into the normal world. The next few weeks were a terrifying confirmation of this discovery. In a downtown park, the lens revealed that the shadow cast by a lamppost on the cobblestones was geometrically incorrect, a dark, angled shape that did not correspond to the light source. In a busy market, the lens showed a small, wooden stall whose perspective was fundamentally fractured, its roofline diverging from the rest of the market stalls, almost imperceptibly leaning inward. And in his own apartment, the lens showed something that made him physically gag. His reflection in the window, a reflection he had carefully avoided for weeks, showed him standing in a room with a fifth wall, a short, dark dead end that did not exist in reality. The mark of the Ashwood Residence was not a curse on him, but a curse on the architecture around him. It was showing him that the world was riddled with small, hidden pockets of spatial sickness. One evening, he was staring at a photo he had taken of a local library, focusing on the distorted floor pattern. He zoomed in on a faint, white spot near the center of the image, visible only through the gray filter. It was a small, pale circle, an iris dot, and it was staring back. He quickly checked the metadata on the image. The photo had been taken 3 days ago. He zoomed out, his heart hammering. The faint white circle was the reflection of a light source in the lens of a camera, positioned high up, hidden in the library's ventilation system. And next to that camera, barely visible in the grain, was a thin, black shadow. The unmistakable outline of a wide-brimmed hat. The caretaker hadn't stopped pursuing him. It was using the small geometrical flaws in the architecture of the city to plant its own eyes. The small, localized ash geometry pockets were its way back into his life. Caleb scrambled to the phone, his mind racing. He had been paid to document the structure, but the caretaker, or the client, was now using his own professional knowledge against him. He had to get rid of the lens. He grabbed a hammer, ready to shatter the scarred glass. But as he raised the hammer, a thought struck him, chilling him to the core. If the lens could see the geometrical sickness, could it also be used to fight it? If the house was made of lies, then the lens was now a detector of those lies. He dropped the hammer. He needed to understand the symbol on the lens, the spiraling knot. He needed to find out who built the Ashwood Residence and why they were actively contaminating the world's architecture. He packed a small bag. He wouldn't destroy the evidence. He would use it. The city was full of flaws now, made visible by the ash. He had to find the biggest flaw, the central contamination point that the caretaker was using to track him. He had to follow the infection back to its source. He took a final, long exposure of his motel room wall with the scarred lens. The resulting photo showed a large, faint spiral of ash geometry coalescing around a small, cracked spot in the drywall, a transmitter, sending his location to the outside. He grabbed the camera and the lens and walked out, leaving the $25,000 as his only collateral. He was no longer just a photographer. He was an accidental operative, tracking the spread of a spatial plague. Caleb ditched his car miles away and began his trek on foot, the scarred wide-angle lens constantly mounted to his camera. He was hunting for the biggest architectural flaw, the one radiating the most potent signal of the Ashwood geometry. He quickly learned how to read the contamination. In ordinary buildings, the lens showed a faint, spiraling stress at corners and joints, the architectural equivalent of white noise. But in certain areas, the spirals were dense, dark, and active, coalescing around a single, central point. He tracked the contamination for 2 days, moving from the anonymous suburbs into the dense, historical core of the city. The trail led him not to a dilapidated building, but to a seemingly flawless, Brutalistra Municipal Archives building. The Locus Library. The Locus Library was a monolith of smooth, unforgiving concrete and minimal windows. It was designed to resist time and nature, a symbol of permanence. But through the contaminated lens, the Locus Library was screaming. The spiraling symbols were everywhere, crawling across the flat concrete facade, sinking into the unlit service alleys, and concentrating around the massive, sealed ventilation system on the roof, the place where he had seen the reflected camera lens days earlier. Caleb felt a cold certainty. This library was the hub. The Ashwood Residence was the machine that created the spatial corruption, and the Locus Library was the network distributing it. He used his old press pass to gain access to the library's architectural records department. He had to find the builder of the Ashwood Residence, the person responsible for the contagious architecture. He found the records for the desolate Mendocino coast property under an obscure file marked simply Project. Ash. The architect was listed as Arthon. The file was sparse, but it contained a final, horrifying detail. Arthon had not just designed the Ashwood Residence. Arthon had been the chief architect for the entire Locus Library complex, overseeing its construction 50 years ago. The library was Thorne's first and largest project, the residence. His last and most focused. Caleb checked the address for Arthon, a historical record listed as an annex office within the library itself, a forgotten top-floor administrative space. He took the elevator to the 5th floor. Even in the brightly lit, beige-tiled hallway, his lens showed the geometric corruption was at its peak. The floor seemed to subtly shift and bend in the viewfinder, the lighting flickering with unseen static. He found the door marked Arthon Private Archives. It was locked. He pulled out a set of simple lockpicks, a leftover skill from a short stint of urban exploration in his 20s, and worked quickly, his senses hyper-alert for the sound of movement. The tumblers clicked. The door swung inward on silent hinges. The office was a small, dusty space that had been left untouched for decades. A single, heavy wooden desk sat in the center, and the walls were lined with meticulously organized blueprints and architectural models covered in thick plastic sheeting. Caleb approached the desk. On top of a large, leather-bound drafting portfolio was a stack of old, black and white photographs. He picked them up. They were identical to the photographs he had seen next to the witness camera in the Ashwood attic. Every picture showed a different man, a different photographer, standing in the center of the attic, frozen in the moment of final, wide-eyed terror. Underneath the stack was a single, typed note, dated 3 weeks ago. Caleb M. is active. The lens is compromised. The system requires recalibration. The spread is accelerating. Caleb's blood ran cold. The client wasn't archivist _404. The client was Arthon, or what Arthon had become. and he knew his name and the state of his gear. He realized his initial thought was right. The $25,000 was not a payment for the photos. It was payment for him to contaminate his own gear and then release the photos onto the internet, thereby completing the architectural contagion cycle. He was an unwilling vector. He looked at the blueprints on the wall, shining his flashlight on them. They were designs for the Locus library. The structure was drawn with terrifying precision, but in the center, over the main concrete core, Thorne had drawn the familiar spiral symbol, a notation marked the anchor. The Locus library was not just a hub. It was a permanent anchor for the spatial corruption, holding the Ashwood Residence's flawed geometry in place and allowing it to spread through the small, uncorrected flaws in the city's other structures. Caleb spun around, suddenly aware that the contamination was heaviest right here. He raised his scarred lens and looked through the viewfinder, aiming it at the back wall of the office. In the physical world, the wall was solid wood paneling. In the viewfinder, the paneling was transparent. The lens showed a massive, pitch-black space behind the wall, a cylindrical void that ran the entire height of the building. And inside that void, held suspended by thick, dark cabling, was a structure. It was the black, twisting, spiral staircase from the Ashwood Residence. The staircase hadn't been an external feature of the house. It was an independent geometric artifact that could be physically transplanted. Thorne hadn't just created a haunted house. He had built a tool to inject non-Euclidean space into the normal world. And the entire thing, the spiral staircase and the void it occupied, was slowly, rhythmically pulsing. Caleb heard the soft, dry clack of a latch behind him. He didn't need to turn around. The caretaker was already there, blocking the office door, his stone face already hardening into its murderous mask. This time, the caretaker was not alone. Flanking him were two other figures, dressed in the uniforms of old library security guards. Their faces also featureless black stone, but smaller, more agile. "You should have kept the flash unit," the caretaker rasped, its voice a grinding sound of stone against stone. "The lens is not enough. You must become the final witness." The three stone figures advanced, their movements synchronized, cutting off any path to the window or the door. Caleb gripped his camera, the lens a terrifying weapon now. The three stone figures advanced slowly, their stone feet making no sound on the dusty wood floor. The two security guards fanned out, flanking the caretaker and cutting off his escape to the door. "The lens must be contained," the caretaker hissed, the rasping sound unnervingly close. "Your photograph of the anchor is the only piece of evidence that shows its function. We can retrieve it now." Caleb had to move into the distortion. He aimed the contaminated lens at the floor. In the viewfinder, the wooden planks around the desk were bending and buckling, forming small, invisible ramps and pits. He saw the latent spiral symbols were densest right beneath the caretaker's feet. He feigned a movement toward the window. As the three figures shifted slightly to intercept him, Caleb pressed the shutter button, not to take a photo, but to use the resulting click as a time distraction. Click. As the sound echoed, Caleb leaped forward, aiming for a spot on the floor that appeared stable in the viewfinder but looked impossible to the naked eye. A narrow, curving line that skirted the desk. The stone figures were too heavy and too slow to move quickly through the subtle, shifting geometry. He landed on the stable line. The caretaker, however, stepped directly onto a point of maximum distortion. The stone creature didn't fall, but its right leg seemed to sink into the floor by a few inches, followed by a grunt like grinding mortar. It was struggling against the very field it commanded. The geometry is unstable. The caretaker rasped to its guards. Hold him. Take the camera. Caleb scrambled to the desk. He had to reach the pulsating spiral staircase behind the wall. He grabbed the heavy drafting portfolio and threw it at the nearest security guard. The guard, whose stone head was still turned toward the door, turned too slowly. The portfolio hit him squarely in the chest. The impact didn't hurt the stone figure, but it caused the geometric field to violently spike. In the viewfinder, the office wall behind the guard suddenly shifted, a black streak running down the plaster. Caleb seized the opportunity. He didn't have a flash unit, but he had a camera. He switched the lens to a short telephoto, his fastest remaining lens, and set the focus to infinity. He aimed it at the massive blueprint pinned to the wall, the schematic of the Locus library with the central note, the anchor. He took 5 rapid-fire shots. The rapid succession of clicks and flashes of the sensor light, combined with the instability of the geometric field, had a surprising effect. The stone figure staggered, and the black stain on the wall behind the first guard grew wider, dissolving the wood paneling. Caleb ran to the newly exposed opening, a gap of absolute blackness that led to the central void. He was looking directly at the suspended, twisting spiral staircase, the anchor of the contagion. The stairs themselves were made of the same ashwane stone, twisting upward into the dark, and they were pulsing with a sickening, slow heartbeat. "You cannot enter the void," the caretaker shrieked, finally stabilizing its footing. "You will be erased." Caleb didn't listen. He leaped into the gap, landing on the cold, dark stone of the spiral stairs. The air here was pure ozone and ash. It was intensely cold, and the gravity felt wrong, tugging him slightly to the side. He could see Arthon's entire operation now. The staircase was not for climbing. It was a conduit channeling the power of the Ashwood Residence into the city's architectural foundations. The pulsing was the transfer of the corrupted geometry. The caretaker and the 2 guards were right behind him, clambering awkwardly onto the first step. They were faster here. This was their domain. Caleb knew he couldn't outrun them. He had to destroy the staircase. He looked down at his camera, the only object from the geometric world that had been allowed into this void. He thought back to the caretaker's face, stripped bare by the flash. The house hated strong, pure light. He couldn't detonate a flash, but he could do something even more direct. He ripped the scarred wide-angle lens off his camera. It was his $25,000 tether, the source of his knowledge and his suffering. The spiraling ash symbol on the glass seemed to glow faintly in the dark. He held the lens up, aiming the scarred glass directly at the anchor staircase. The light from the office hallway, filtered through the contaminated lens, struck the spiraling stone. The lens, by its very nature, was designed to introduce distortion. And now, carrying the symbol of the geometric sickness, it was actively reflecting and amplifying the corruption. A sharp, searing light erupted from the center of the lens itself, directed straight onto the surface of the spiral staircase. The light wasn't white or yellow. It was a pure, cold gray, the color of concentrated ash. The staircase screamed. Not the glass-shattering shriek of the building, but a high-pitched, structural whine. Thin veins of white ash on the stone staircase began to glow, then crackled. The caretaker, already on the staircase behind Caleb, suddenly froze, Its stone arms raised to shield its face. The grey light was melting the delicate, structural ash that held its stone form together. Caleb took a deep breath, and with a guttural roar, he hurled the scarred lens, his only link to the truth, like a grenade against the nearest stone riser of the spiral staircase. The impact was quiet. Clink. The glass of the lens shattered instantly. The fine, crystalline ash particles embedded in the glass exploded outward, dispersing into the black void. The staircase immediately ceased pulsing. The anchor had been broken. The staircase let out one final, terrible structural groan, and the cabling holding it in place began to snap. Caleb felt the ground shift violently beneath his feet. The geometric void was collapsing. The geometric void surrounding the spiral staircase exploded outward as the scarred lens shattered. The dispersal of the ash-infused glass was like a chaotic floodlight, introducing too much truth and instability into the system. The black cabling that held the anchor staircase in place snapped with sounds like heavy cannon fire. The staircase, no longer held in a non-Euclidean state, instantly succumbed to gravity and physics. It fell with a screeching, tearing sound down the central shaft of the Locus library, taking the void with it. Caleb scrambled out of the collapsing opening and back into Arthur's office. The caretaker and the two guards were gone. They hadn't fallen. They had been erased. With the anchor broken, the corrupted geometric space that sustained their stone bodies was instantly invalidated, and they dissolved into fine, odorless piles of white ash that settled on the floor. The same ash that had scarred his lens. The Locus library began to groan, not with dread, but with structural failure. The collapse of the geometric core caused a physical chain reaction. The ceiling of the office cracked wide open, and the floor beneath Caleb's feet pitched violently. The entire fifth floor, built around the architectural lie of Arthur's central void, was ripping itself apart. Caleb grabbed his remaining camera, now devoid of its key lens, and the file on Project Ash. He stumbled out into the hallway, which was now filled with the sound of snapping rebar and falling concrete. He didn't take the elevator, which was useless. He raced to the emergency exit, tumbling down the concrete stairs. The lights of the stairwell flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. He burst out of the back exit of the Locus library complex just as the building began its spectacular, terminal collapse. The smooth, monolithic concrete structure didn't crumble. It imploded. The central core of the library, where the spiral staircase had been anchored, simply caved in on itself, pulling the upper floors into a massive, echoing crater. The event was instantaneous, loud, and final. Caleb ran until he reached a park a quarter-mile away, watching the dust cloud bloom over the cityscape. The Locus library, the anchor of the corruption, was gone. The aftermath in the days that followed, the story was predictably sanitized. The official report blamed a catastrophic structural failure due to substandard materials used 50 years prior. Arthur's name was mentioned only briefly as the original architect. Caleb went home. He developed the final, rapid-fire shots he had taken of Arthur's blueprint. The photos were clear. The Locus library was the anchor, the spiral staircase was the injection point, and the Ashwood Residence was the permanent, self-sustaining factory of the geometrical sickness, designed to slowly erase the physical reality of its surroundings. Caleb was free, but irrevocably changed. He was wealthy. The $25,000 was never retracted. But he couldn't spend his life hiding. He was an architect of light who had accidentally stumbled upon the architecture of darkness. He bought a new camera and a new set of lenses, but he kept the damaged D850 body and the project. Ashfile. He never used the wide-angle lens again, of course, but he found that its permanent mark on his perception remained. He continued to see the small, fleeting errors in the world's geometry. A slight bend in a power line, a shadow that didn't quite line up, a door that seemed to be marginally too small for its frame. These weren't necessarily signs of a new contamination, but proof of the permanent, underlying flaws that the Ashwood geometry had exploited. The final visit 1 year later, Caleb drove back up the Mendocino coast. He needed to know if the destruction of the anchor had nullified the factory. He found the coordinates for the Ashwood Residence. The familiar, dirt logging road was overgrown, almost impassable. He parked his car and hiked the remaining distance. When he reached the ridge, he stopped and stared. The Ashwood Residence was gone. Not collapsed, not burned. It was simply not there. The cliff face where the house had stood was smooth, unbroken stone. The enormous, twisted oak tree that had dominated the yard was absent. The ground was just a dense mat of scrub brush and coastal grass. The house had completely reverted, leaving no trace, no rubble, no foundation. It was as if the coordinates had been pointing to a temporary, physically impossible structure that had finally been erased from the real world. Caleb walked to the edge of the cliff. The smell of salt and fresh air was clean, pure. The geometry was correct. He pulled out his camera and took a photograph of the empty landscape. He used a clean, new lens. The image was perfectly normal. He turned to leave, satisfied. But as he looked down, his eyes caught something near the edge of the cliff, half buried in the soil. It was a small, ancient object, cold to the touch. He reached down and pulled it out. It was the original antique iron key. The key he had used to open the front door. He held the key up to the light. The spiraling, indecipherable symbols etched into the iron were still there, clear and deep. But now, lying beside the key, half hidden by a clump of dirt, was a second object, a small, charred fragment of plastic. It was the microchip from the memory card he had bitten and spat out on the highway a year ago. It hadn't been destroyed. It had been spit back out of the geometric field and was lying there, waiting. Caleb looked at the empty cliff face, then at the key and the evidence in his hand. The Ashwood Residence was gone, but the knowledge of its geometry remained, and the key to its existence was now back in his possession. He put the key and the charred chip into his pocket. He was no longer running from the ghost house. He was carrying it, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that somewhere in the world, the rules of light and space were waiting to be broken again.